The loneliest man in the desert is the one who still chooses kindness. The wind carried dust across the empty road as Samuel Reed rode slowly beneath the fading gold of a western sunset. Out here, 30 miles from the nearest town, and even farther from anyone who cared whether a man lived or died, kindness usually cost more than most men could afford. Samuel knew that better than anyone. For 3 years he had ridden the lonely trails between settlements, fixing fences, trading small jobs for meals, and sleeping wherever the prairie allowed. No family, no ranch, no one waiting for him anywhere. Just the long miles and the steady breathing of the old bay horse beneath him. The horse's name was Dusty, and Dusty was the only thing Samuel truly owned in this wide and unforgiving land. Without that horse, a man wasn't just poor. He was stranded. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the sagebrush and cracked earth. Samuel adjusted the brim of his worn hat and studied the road ahead. He had planned to reach Dry Creek before dark, a small settlement about 12 miles east where a man could sometimes find coffee and a quiet place near the stable. But the desert had other plans. Something moved ahead on the trail, barely visible through the haze of dust and heat that still clung to the air even as evening settled in. Samuel slowed Dusty with a gentle pull on the reins. At first he thought it was just a bundle of cloth or maybe a broken saddle someone had tossed aside. Then the shape shifted. A man. An old man. Samuel dismounted immediately, boots touching the dry ground with a soft crunch. The figure lying beside the trail wore weathered buckskin and a necklace of small turquoise beads. His gray hair was braided loosely, and his breathing was shallow but steady. A native elder, alone in a place where no one should have been walking. Dusty snorted quietly behind Samuel, as if sensing the strange stillness in the air. The old man's hand rested weakly against the ground. Fingers curled toward the dirt as though he had been reaching for something that never came. Samuel crouched beside him. "Sir, can you hear me?" The elder's eyes opened slowly, dark and tired but clear. For a moment, they simply looked at each other while the wind whispered across the prairie. Samuel could see the truth immediately. The man wasn't injured. He was exhausted. Bone-tired in the way a man becomes after too many miles under a brutal sun. The kind of exhaustion that ends with a body simply giving up. Samuel glanced down the empty road in both directions. No wagons. No riders. No dust clouds on the horizon. Whoever this man had been traveling with was gone. Or perhaps he had never been traveling with anyone at all. The elder tried to push himself upright, but managed only a weak movement before falling back against the ground. Samuel felt a quiet heaviness settle in his chest. The nearest water was at least 10 miles away. Walking that distance under the fading heat would be difficult even for a strong man half this elder's age. Without help, the road would finish what the desert had started. Samuel looked back at Dusty. The old horse stood patiently, tail flicking at invisible flies, waiting for the next command like he always did. A good horse. Loyal. Steady. The kind of animal that had carried Samuel across hundreds of miles of lonely country. The kind a man could build a life around. Samuel exhaled slowly and rested his hand against the warm leather of the saddle. For a long moment he said nothing. The wind moved through the sage again, soft and steady, like the land itself was listening. Finally Samuel turned back to the elder and lifted the reins gently from the saddle horn. He placed them into the old man's hand. "Take the horse," Samuel said quietly. "He knows the road better than I do." The old man stared at the leather reins resting in his hands, as if they carried more weight than the horse itself. For a moment he did not move, and neither did Samuel. The desert was quiet except for the soft shifting of Dusty's hooves against the dry ground. Samuel could see the question in the elder's eyes, the kind that did not need words. Out here a horse was not simply transportation. It was water, distance, survival. Giving one away was not charity. It was sacrifice. Samuel tipped his hat back slightly and offered the faintest smile. "He is a good horse," he said calmly. "You ride him east about 10 miles, and you will find Dry Creek. There is water there. A stable too." The elder slowly pushed himself upright, his movements careful but steady now that hope had replaced exhaustion. His hand rested against Dusty's neck, and the old horse responded with a quiet breath as though already accepting his new rider. The elder studied Samuel for another long moment before speaking in careful English. "And you?" Samuel glanced across the wide stretch of fading land where the road curved into endless dust and pale grass. The sky above them had begun to soften into evening colors, long streaks of amber and violet stretching across the horizon. "I will walk," Samuel answered simply. The elder frowned slightly, as if measuring the distance in his mind. 10 miles in this country could feel like 20 when the night wind began to rise. Samuel saw the concern, but only shrugged. "I have walked worse roads than this." For a moment neither man moved. Then the elder placed his foot into the stirrup and pulled himself slowly onto the saddle. Dusty shifted once beneath the unfamiliar rider, but quickly settled, patient as always. Samuel stepped back and lifted his hand, giving the horse a gentle pat along the shoulder. "Take care of him," he said quietly. The elder nodded once, deeply, the kind of nod that carried respect older than any language. "My name is White Feather," the elder said. Samuel considered that for a moment, then tipped his hat again. "Samuel Reed." White Feather studied him once more as though committing the name to memory. Then with a soft movement of the reins, he turned Dusty toward the eastern road. The horse began walking slowly at first, hooves tapping steadily against the hardened earth. Samuel watched them go, the shape of horse and rider growing smaller against the vast open land. After a few hundred yards, White Feather turned once in the saddle and raised his hand in silent gratitude before continuing toward the distant promise of water. Soon the fading light swallowed them entirely. Samuel stood alone beside the empty trail. The sudden quiet felt heavier now. Without Dusty beside him, the road seemed wider, the desert larger, the sky stretching farther in every direction. Samuel pulled his coat tighter against the cooling air and began walking east. The ground beneath his boots was rough with small stones and patches of dry grass that scratched softly against his trousers. Every step carried the faint crunch of dust that had not felt rain in weeks. 10 miles was not impossible, he reminded himself. A steady man could walk that distance in 3 hours if the night stayed calm. The first mile passed quietly as twilight deepened. Coyotes began calling somewhere in the distance, their voices echoing faintly through the hills. Samuel kept his pace even, his eyes following the pale ribbon of road illuminated by the rising moon. The desert after sunset had its own kind of beauty. The heat faded quickly, replaced by a cool wind that carried the scent of sagebrush and distant water. Yet even as Samuel walked, a quiet thought crossed his mind. Dusty had carried him across hundreds of miles, through storms, through winter roads that turned to frozen mud, through towns where no one remembered his name. And now the old horse was gone. Samuel paused briefly and looked back along the darkening trail behind him. Nothing but empty land and long shadows. He let out a slow breath and adjusted the brim of his hat once more before continuing forward into the quiet night. Somewhere ahead, Dry Creek waited. Somewhere ahead, water and a warm, stable light would greet him. And somewhere far behind, an old horse carried a tired rider home across the open desert. The moon had climbed halfway across the sky by the time Samuel Reed had walked what he guessed to be 4 miles, maybe 5. In the open desert, distance had a way of stretching and folding back on itself, and a man could swear he had walked forever only to find the road barely changed. The wind had grown cooler now, brushing across the prairie in slow, steady waves that carried the dry scent of sage and dust. Samuel kept moving with the same quiet rhythm, boots pressing into the pale road while the stars began filling the dark sky above him. He did not complain about the miles. He had chosen them the moment he placed those reins into White Feather's hands. Still, walking alone after sunset made a man notice things he might otherwise ignore. The silence was deeper without the soft breathing of a horse beside him. Even the sound of his own footsteps seemed louder now, echoing across the empty land like someone following just a few paces behind. Samuel paused for a moment and glanced back across the long ribbon of road. Nothing moved behind him except drifting dust glowing faintly under the moonlight. The desert had returned to its usual stillness. He adjusted his hat and continued forward. What Samuel did not know was that he had not been completely alone earlier that evening. Nearly half a mile away, hidden behind a ridge of low sandstone and twisted juniper trees, another pair of eyes had been watching the entire moment unfold. A young woman crouched quietly along the rocky hillside, her dark hair braided with small pieces of turquoise that glimmered faintly under the moonlight. She had remained perfectly still when Samuel had first appeared on the road with the old elder lying beside the trail. From that distance, she had watched everything. She had watched the stranger dismount. She had watched him kneel beside the exhausted rider. And most of all, she had watched the moment he gave away his horse. The young woman's name was Iana. She had been tracking her grandfather since the afternoon when he failed to return to their camp. The old man often traveled alone between settlements, trading stories and herbs with nearby towns. But when the sun began sinking and his horse had not appeared on the horizon, worry had settled across the camp like an approaching storm. Iana had volunteered to search the southern trail. She had followed the faint hoofprints across nearly 12 miles of desert before she spotted Dusty standing beside the road and Samuel Reed kneeling next to the elder. From her hiding place, she had waited, uncertain what kind of man the stranger might be. Out here, kindness was rare. Suspicion was safer. But the moment Samuel placed the reins into White Feather's hands, Iana felt something inside her chest shift. She had expected questions. Bargaining perhaps. Maybe a demand for payment or supplies. Instead, she watched the stranger step back and offer the horse freely, as if the choice required no thought at all. When White Feather rode east toward Dry Creek, Iana remained where she was, her gaze following Samuel Reed as he began walking alone down the moonlit road. Iana had lived her entire life among riders. She understood what a horse meant to a man traveling across this land. A horse was distance. A horse was protection against the endless miles. A horse was survival when the desert decided to test a traveler's strength. And this man had given away his only one without hesitation. The young woman slowly stood from her hiding place and stepped forward onto the ridge. The moonlight revealed the long road stretching east, where Samuel's small figure continued moving steadily through the pale dust. She studied him quietly for several moments. A strange man, she whispered softly to herself. Behind her, tied among the juniper trees, waited her own horse. Iana walked back toward the animal and rested her hand against its neck while her eyes remained fixed on the distant traveler. Part of her wanted to ride forward immediately and offer him help, but another thought held her back. She had learned long ago that the desert often revealed a person's true character through patience. Instead, she untied the horse slowly and mounted the saddle with careful silence. Iana turned the horse toward the east, but did not ride directly onto the road. She followed along the higher ridge where the trail curved beside the valley below. From there she could watch Samuel Reed without disturbing him. The rider moved at a distance, silent as the drifting wind, while the lone traveler continued walking beneath the quiet sky. And as the night deepened across the wide western desert, Iana realized something unusual. This stranger who walked alone beneath the stars had no idea that someone was now watching over the road ahead. Samuel Reed continued walking beneath the deepening night, each step carrying him farther across the quiet desert road while the moon drifted slowly above the distant hills. The wind had changed direction now, colder and sharper, sliding across the valley like invisible water. Samuel pulled his coat closer around his shoulders and kept moving with the same steady pace he had held since leaving White Feather behind. Walking alone in the dark demanded patience more than strength. A man who rushed would only exhaust himself before morning. The road ahead shimmered pale beneath the moonlight, winding gently between low hills and scattered patches of sagebrush that rustled softly each time the wind passed through. Samuel counted his steps without thinking, a habit he had learned years ago during long cattle drives. After what felt like another mile, he paused briefly beside a flat stone rising from the dirt and rubbed the stiffness from his hands. The silence was almost complete except for the distant call of night birds and the occasional whisper of grass bending along the roadside. He looked up at the stars for a moment and judged the time by their slow movement. Midnight was still some hours away. Dry Creek should be closer now. Perhaps 4 miles if his guess about the distance had been right earlier. Samuel exhaled slowly and continued forward. Behind him, high along the ridge where the road curved through the valley, Iana guided her horse quietly across the rocky ground. She kept her distance carefully, never allowing the animal's hooves to strike loose stone that might echo across the quiet desert. From this height, she could see the narrow road clearly in the silver light. Samuel Reed appeared below as a small moving shadow against the pale earth, walking steadily, without hesitation. Iana studied him with quiet curiosity. Most men who lost a horse in this country would show frustration or anger. Some would shout at the sky or curse their own luck. Yet this stranger moved forward as if the sacrifice had been nothing more than a simple decision. No regret. No hesitation. The young woman leaned forward slightly in the saddle and allowed her horse to step carefully along the ridge. She had been raised among riders who understood the desert better than any map. From her position, she could see the faint shimmer of water far to the east, where Dry Creek cut through the valley floor. Samuel was heading in the correct direction, though the distance was still greater than he believed. Iana knew that the road ahead dipped into a shallow canyon, where the wind gathered and temperatures dropped quickly after midnight. A traveler on foot would feel that cold long before reaching town. She considered riding down to him now. The thought lingered in her mind as the horse beneath her shifted quietly. Yet something made her wait. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was respect for the quiet determination she saw in the way Samuel walked alone beneath the wide sky. She decided to remain unseen a little longer. Below in the valley, Samuel slowed again as the road curved around a cluster of tall desert rocks. The land opened into a shallow basin where the wind moved freely across the ground. The sudden gust brushed past him with a low, rushing sound, carrying fine dust that swirled briefly around his boots before fading into the darkness. Samuel stopped and studied the land ahead. Something about the road looked different here. He could not explain why, but the silence carried a strange weight as though the desert itself were holding its breath. He listened carefully. At first he heard nothing but the steady whisper of wind. Then, very faintly, another sound reached him. Hooves. Not close. Not even near enough to cause concern. Just the distant rhythm of a single horse somewhere beyond the hills. Samuel tilted his head slightly and looked across the valley, but saw nothing except shadows and pale rock reflecting the moonlight. He waited another moment before shaking his head with a quiet breath. The desert often carried sounds farther than expected. A rider could be 10 miles away and still seem close enough to touch. Samuel turned his attention back to the road and continued walking east toward Dry Creek, unaware that the sound he heard had not come from miles away at all. High above the valley on the shadowed ridge, Iana slowed her horse and watched him move forward beneath the moon. Her eyes remained fixed on the lone traveler while the wind carried the faint echo of hoofbeats across the silent desert night. Samuel Reed walked deeper into the basin where the road narrowed between low canyon walls, and the wind there moved differently than it had on the open plain. Instead of sweeping across the desert in wide, silent currents, it funneled through the stone passage in long, steady breaths that hummed softly against the rocks. The sound reminded Samuel of distant water running through a wooden trough, quiet but constant. He kept his pace steady, though the cold now pressed through the thin seams of his coat and into his shoulders. The desert after midnight had a way of reminding a man how small he truly was. Samuel did not complain about the cold. He had known worse nights on the trail, nights where snow drifted against saddle leather and the stars felt sharp enough to cut through the sky. Compared to those winters, this desert wind was merely uncomfortable. Still, he flexed his hands now and then to keep the feeling in his fingers. The road dipped slightly ahead, curving along the shallow canyon floor where scattered stones reflected pale moonlight. Samuel estimated he had walked nearly 8 miles since leaving White Feather. Dry Creek should not be far now. Perhaps another hour if the road continued straight. He slowed briefly when he reached a bend where the canyon walls rose a little higher on both sides. From this point the valley behind him disappeared completely, replaced by shadowed stone and narrow strips of sky overhead. The wind grew quieter here. Too quiet. Samuel stopped and listened again. The same faint rhythm reached him once more. Hooves. Soft. Careful. Not the echo of distant riders traveling the main road. This sound carried a deliberate pace, as if someone were guiding a horse slowly over rough ground. Samuel did not turn immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and let the wind move past his ears. The sound came from above the canyon, somewhere along the ridge. He waited another moment before speaking calmly into the darkness. "You might as well come down from there," he said, his voice carrying evenly through the still air. A horse cannot hide forever on loose stone. High above the canyon trail, Iana drew a slow breath and eased her horse to a stop. She had followed Samuel carefully for nearly 2 miles since the basin began, choosing her path along the ridge where shadows covered most of the rocks. Yet the canyon floor carried sound in strange ways. Even the careful placement of a single hoof could travel farther than expected through narrow stone passages. A faint smile touched her face when she realized the traveler had noticed her presence without ever looking directly toward the ridge. "A careful man," she murmured quietly. For several seconds she remained still, studying Samuel's figure below. The stranger stood calmly in the middle of the trail with his hands resting loosely at his sides. He did not appear frightened. He did not reach for a weapon or step away from the road. Instead, he simply waited beneath the moonlight as though he had expected company all along. Ayanna guided her horse forward, allowing it to descend slowly along a narrow slope that curved toward the canyon floor. The stones shifted softly beneath the animal's hooves, but the sound no longer needed hiding. Samuel watched the movement above him as a dark silhouette emerged along the ridge line and began descending toward the trail. The rider moved with quiet confidence, guiding the horse down a path that would have been difficult for anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. Within a few moments, the animal stepped onto the canyon road about 20 yards away from Samuel. Moonlight revealed the figure clearly now. A young woman sat upright in the saddle, her long braid resting across one shoulder, while small turquoise beads reflected faint flashes of silver light. She studied Samuel with calm, steady eyes that carried neither fear nor suspicion. The horse beneath her shifted once before settling again. Samuel tipped his hat slightly. "You have been following me for a while," he said in a relaxed voice. Ayanna nodded once. "Since the moment you gave the horse away." Samuel raised an eyebrow at that. "Then you already know the rest of the story." The young woman looked down the road toward the distant lights of Dry Creek glowing faintly along the horizon. Then she returned her gaze to the traveler standing alone in the canyon. "No," she said quietly. "I only know the beginning." Samuel Reed studied the young rider for a quiet moment while the canyon wind moved gently between them. The moon hung high above the narrow strip of sky, washing the pale road with silver light. The woman's horse shifted once and then grew still again, its breath drifting into the cool air like thin smoke. Samuel noticed the careful way she held the reins, steady but relaxed, the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. "Then I suppose the rest of the story is not very exciting," Samuel said calmly. "A man gave away a horse, and now he walks to Dry Creek. That is all." The young woman tilted her head slightly, studying him as though measuring the weight of his words. "That is not all," she replied quietly. "Most men would have asked something in return." Samuel shrugged lightly. "Most men are smarter than I am." A faint smile touched her face at that, though her eyes remained thoughtful. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. The canyon around them carried the low whisper of wind brushing along stone. Somewhere far away a night bird called across the valley. Finally the young rider guided her horse forward a few slow steps until she stood closer to Samuel on the narrow trail. "My name is Ayanna," she said. Samuel nodded politely. "Samuel Reed." She repeated the name softly, as though committing it to memory, just as White Feather had done earlier that evening. Then her gaze drifted briefly down the road toward the distant glow of Dry Creek barely visible along the horizon. "You are still several miles from town," she said. "The canyon bends twice more before the road opens again. Walking will take longer than you think." Samuel glanced toward the faint lights in the distance, and then back at her. "I have time." Ayanna watched him carefully, the quiet determination in his voice confirming what she had already suspected from the ridge above. This man truly did not regret what he had done. She reached down and gently stroked the neck of her horse while considering her next words. "The elder you helped tonight," she said slowly. "His name is White Feather." Samuel gave a small nod. "He told me." Ayanna's eyes brightened slightly with approval. "White Feather is respected among my people. Many listen when he speaks." Samuel shifted his weight slightly, but said nothing. He had traveled enough across the frontier to understand the meaning behind her words. A man like White Feather did not ride alone without purpose. The young woman studied Samuel for another moment before continuing. "You did not know who he was when you helped him." It was not a question. Samuel shook his head once. "No, and yet you gave him the only horse you had." Samuel looked briefly down at the dusty road beneath his boots before answering. "A tired man on foot in this country does not travel far. Ayana listened quietly, the same thought passing again through her mind that had formed earlier on the ridge. Most travelers she had encountered during trading journeys or scouting rides spoke with pride about their strength or their survival skills. Samuel Reed spoke instead with simple understanding. The difference was difficult to explain, but she felt it clearly. The wind shifted again through the canyon, carrying the distant scent of water from Dry Creek far ahead. Ayana lifted her head slightly, as if listening to something beyond the reach of ordinary hearing. For a brief moment, she looked past Samuel toward the open valley beyond the canyon walls. Then she turned back toward him. "My people say the desert watches every choice a traveler makes," she said softly. "Sometimes, the land remembers kindness longer than men do." Samuel raised an eyebrow with quiet amusement. "If the desert remembers anything, it has been very patient with me." Ayana smiled again, this time more openly. She looked down at the empty stretch of road before them, and then back toward Samuel standing alone beneath the moonlight. "Perhaps," she said, "but patience does not mean silence." She gently turned her horse so that it stood facing the road toward Dry Creek. "Come," she added after a moment. "You have walked enough tonight." Samuel looked up at her, puzzled. Ayana leaned slightly to the side and extended the reins toward him. "Ride with me," she said quietly. "The rest of the road will pass faster that way." Samuel Reed looked up at the reins extended toward him and then at the horse standing calmly beside Ayana. For a moment he did not move. The offer surprised him more than he expected. Out on the frontier, a horse was rarely shared with a stranger, especially during the deep hours of night when the desert grew colder and the roads more uncertain. Samuel studied her expression carefully, searching for hesitation or doubt, but the young woman only waited with quiet patience as the canyon wind brushed gently across the narrow trail. Finally, he gave a small shake of his head. "You do not have to do that," he said calmly. "The road is not much farther." Ayana raised one eyebrow slightly, as if she had heard that kind of stubborn pride before. "You have already walked nearly 9 miles tonight," she replied. "The canyon ahead turns twice more before the valley opens. Walking will take at least another hour." Samuel glanced down the trail again. The faint glow of Dry Creek remained distant, barely more than a soft shimmer along the horizon. He could feel the tired weight building slowly in his legs now that the night had grown colder. Still, he hesitated. "Your horse carries you easily enough," he said. "It does not need the extra burden." Ayana let out a soft breath that might have been amusement. "You are not a burden, Samuel Reed. You are simply a traveler who helped someone when no one else was there." She shifted slightly in the saddle and nodded toward the horse's broad back. "Besides, my horse is stronger than he looks." Samuel studied the animal. For a moment, it was a sturdy desert horse, smaller than Dusty but built with the quiet strength of something accustomed to long distances and rough terrain. The horse flicked its ears toward him as if acknowledging the silent inspection. After another moment, Samuel stepped closer and placed one hand against the saddle horn. "If the horse complains," he said lightly, "I will climb back down." Ayana smiled faintly and moved slightly forward in the saddle to give him space behind her. Samuel swung himself up with careful balance, settling onto the back of the horse. The animal shifted once beneath the new weight, but quickly steadied again. The warmth from the horse's body felt almost startling after hours of walking through the cold desert wind. Ayana adjusted the reins and gently guided the horse forward along the canyon trail. For a while neither of them spoke. The horse moved at a steady pace beneath the moonlight, while the narrow canyon slowly widened around them. Samuel noticed how easily Ayana guided the animal through the rocky path without needing to look down. She rode with the quiet confidence of someone who knew every turn of the land. After several minutes, Samuel finally spoke again. "You said the elder is respected among your people." Ayana nodded slightly. "Yes. Then I imagine someone will be worried that he did not return tonight." "They already were," she replied. "That is why I was searching the road." Samuel considered that for a moment and then nodded slowly. The pieces of the night's strange path began fitting together in his mind. "So you saw everything?" "Yes." The horse continued along the canyon road while the sound of hooves echoed softly between the stone walls. Samuel leaned back slightly in the saddle, letting the steady rhythm carry him forward. After another moment, he asked quietly, "Did you tell anyone?" Ayana shook her head once. "Not yet." Samuel raised an eyebrow behind her shoulder. "Why not?" She looked ahead toward the widening mouth of the canyon where the desert valley opened under the moon. For a few seconds she said nothing. Then she answered in a calm, thoughtful voice. Because some stories are better told in the morning. Samuel followed her gaze toward the open land ahead. In the distance, the faint lantern lights of Dry Creek now shimmered more clearly across the valley floor. The town looked small from this distance, little more than a cluster of glowing dots against the dark desert. Ayanna slowed the horse slightly as they approached the final bend of the canyon. The wind shifted again, carrying the cool scent of water and wood smoke from the town ahead. Samuel breathed in the familiar smell and felt a quiet sense of relief settle into his chest. Yet as the canyon walls finally opened and the road stretched wide before them, Ayanna's eyes moved not toward the town, but toward the dark western horizon behind them. Her gaze lingered there for a moment, thoughtful and distant, as though she expected something to appear along the silent desert road they had left behind. The horse carried them out of the canyon and into the open valley where the desert stretched wide beneath the pale silver of the moon. Dry Creek now stood clearly ahead, a quiet cluster of wooden buildings resting beside the thin ribbon of water that gave the town its name. A few lanterns still burned outside the saloon and the small trading post, their warm glow flickering gently against the night air. From this distance the town looked peaceful, almost fragile against the vast land surrounding it. Ayanna guided the horse down the gradual slope toward the road that led into town, but her eyes continued drifting back toward the western horizon. Samuel noticed the movement and followed her gaze. The desert behind them appeared empty at first glance. Nothing but open land, low ridges, and the long pale road they had traveled through the night. Yet after a moment Samuel noticed something unusual. Far away along the horizon, a thin cloud of dust had begun rising slowly into the moonlight. It was faint and distant, but it moved with purpose. Samuel narrowed his eyes slightly. "Riders," he said quietly. Ayanna nodded once as if she had expected that answer. The horse slowed beneath them as she studied the growing dust cloud with careful attention. From this distance it was impossible to count them, but the movement was steady and organized, not the scattered travel of traders or wanderers. A group. A large one. Samuel leaned forward slightly in the saddle to see more clearly. The dust cloud stretched wider than he first thought, spreading along the road in a line that seemed to ripple across the moonlit desert. "That is more than a few riders," he said calmly. Ayanna did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned the horse toward a low rise overlooking the road so they could watch the movement from a higher point. The animal climbed the small hill with steady steps until the valley opened fully before them. From there the distant riders became easier to see, small dark shapes moving together across the pale land. The rhythm of hooves did not reach them yet, but the formation told its own story. Samuel studied the horizon carefully. Even at this distance he could see the long line of riders spreading across the road, dozens at least, perhaps more. Ayanna sat quietly in the saddle, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "They ride quickly," Samuel observed. "And they follow the road you and I came from." The young woman nodded again. "Yes." Samuel considered that for a moment and then asked the question forming in his mind. "Are they yours?" Ayanna looked at him briefly and then back toward the approaching riders. The dust cloud behind them grew thicker now, catching the moonlight as the line moved steadily closer across the open valley. After a few seconds, she answered calmly. "Some of them." Samuel raised an eyebrow slightly, but did not press further. He had lived long enough on the frontier to understand when answers would come in their own time. The horse shifted beneath them while they continued watching the distant riders move through the desert night. Slowly the shapes became clearer. Not 10 riders. Not 20. The line stretched wider and wider as more figures appeared behind the first wave. Samuel exhaled softly. That is a large group to be traveling this late. Ayanna rested one hand gently against the saddle horn while the other held the reins loosely. "The desert carries news faster than men think," she said quietly. Samuel glanced at her again. "What kind of news?" She did not answer right away. Instead, she pointed toward the center of the approaching line. "Look closely." Samuel narrowed his eyes against the moonlight and studied the distant riders more carefully. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then, slowly, one shape at the front of the formation became familiar. A tall horse. a rider sitting upright in the saddle with steady confidence. And beneath that rider moved a horse Samuel would recognize anywhere. Dusty. Samuel blinked once, surprised. The old bay horse moved proudly at the head of the riders, carrying White Feather as they crossed the desert road toward the valley. Samuel let out a quiet breath of disbelief while the line of riders behind the elder continued growing wider across the moonlit land. Ayanna watched his reaction with a calm expression before finally speaking again. My grandfather does not travel alone for long. Samuel Reed watched the riders cross the valley while the dust cloud behind them slowly dissolved into the cool desert night. The distance between them closed steadily now, and the quiet valley began to fill with the low thunder of hooves rolling across the hard ground. It was not a frantic sound, not the scattered noise of men chasing something across the plains. This rhythm carried purpose and order, like a long line of riders traveling together with a single intention. Samuel sat silently behind Ayanna in the saddle, while the horse beneath them stood still at the crest of the small hill. The lantern lights of Dry Creek flickered below, but the town itself seemed unaware of the quiet movement unfolding beyond its edge. Samuel studied the approaching riders again and counted more shapes forming behind White Feather with every passing moment. Dozens had become scores, and scores now stretched into a line that seemed to fill the desert road itself. The moonlight reflected along the riders' shoulders and hats, while the steady motion carried them forward like a dark river moving through pale sand. Dusty led them all, the old horse's familiar stride unmistakable even at a distance. Samuel felt a quiet mixture of surprise and disbelief settle across his thoughts. You were not exaggerating, he said quietly. Ayanna shook her head once. My grandfather believes a kindness must never travel alone. The riders continued forward until the distance between them and the hill shortened enough that individual figures could be seen clearly. White Feather rode at the front with calm dignity, Dusty moving beneath him with the same steady patience he had always carried on long trails. The elder raised one hand as the riders slowed across the valley floor. The sound of hooves softened as the long line came to a gradual stop several yards from the hill where Samuel and Ayanna waited. For a moment the desert returned to silence again. Hundreds of riders sat quietly beneath the moonlight, their horses breathing gently in the cool night air. No one rushed forward. No one spoke loudly. The stillness itself carried the weight of respect. White Feather guided Dusty up the slope toward them until he stood a few steps away. The elder looked first at Ayanna and nodded softly to his granddaughter before turning his gaze towards Samuel Reed. His expression held the same calm strength Samuel had seen earlier on the road. For several seconds, the elder simply studied the man who had given away his only horse beneath the setting sun. Then White Feather slowly dismounted from Dusty and placed one hand against the horse's neck before speaking. When a man saves another traveler on the road, he said in a steady voice, the desert remembers. Samuel shifted slightly, unsure how to respond to such a gathering. I only gave him a ride, he replied quietly. White Feather shook his head gently. No, the elder said. You gave him life. The elder then stepped aside and lifted his hand toward the long line of riders waiting behind him. These men and women are my people. When they heard what you had done, they chose to ride through the night. Samuel looked across the valley again. The riders stretched farther than he had first realized, nearly 200 figures waiting calmly in the moonlight beside their horses. The sight felt almost unreal against the quiet desert landscape. White Feather rested his hand once more against Dusty's saddle and continued speaking. You walk through the dark so another man could reach home, he said. Tonight we ride so that you will never walk alone again. Ayanna watched Samuel carefully while the elder stepped forward and offered the reins of Dusty back to him. The old horse flicked its ears as if recognizing its familiar rider standing nearby. Samuel took the reins slowly, his hand resting against the worn leather for a moment before he looked up again at the long line of riders waiting silently across the valley. The lantern lights of Dry Creek flickered softly below the hill, but Samuel realized that the small town no longer felt like the center of the world in that moment. Out here beneath the endless sky, surrounded by 200 quiet riders who had crossed the desert through the night, he understood something simple and powerful. A single act of kindness might begin with one man on a lonely road, But sometimes the answer returned with the strength of an entire people riding beside him across the open land.